The practice of reflective teaching is an integral part of professional development. It is the way individuals can continue on a trajectory of lifelong learning and improvement, even without external formal learning opportunities. While some of the basic questions for reflecting on our teaching remain the same, like, were my learning objectives met in that class? Did my students learn what I expected them to? And how do I know that? And what could I do better next time? The way we integrate it into our practice is unique to every individual. You have to find the reflective technique that works for you to make you a better teacher. Reflective teaching is built into the DNA of our program. Our faculty formally reflect on their annual teaching observations, their student evaluations, and each class they have taught over the course of the past year. We also encourage our faculty to have students reflect on their performance in class, and we've incorporated self-identification of language weaknesses into the curriculum. In my experience, the IEI faculty are some of the best reflective teachers I've known. And in this video, you will hear how several of them have personalized their reflective process and how the practice of reflection has improved their teaching.
Reflective teaching is necessary for me. It helps me see what worked, what didn't work, and how I can improve my overall teaching experience. I try to pay attention to the methodology that I used and the way I delivered a topic or concept. When I finish teaching a class and look back, I try to remember the students' reactions as well. It's important to try to lower the affective filter in the classroom and be aware of cultural sensitivities. I think it's important to look at activities or assignments that worked and see what made them successful. That way I can recreate them next time I teach that class. I can also see if I can transfer the techniques to other classes I teach. I try to take notes so I can read them later and not forget to do them again. As I said before, I also look at the activities that didn't work and try to determine why they didn't work. That way I can see if I should modify them, improve them, and try to implement them in the future. And if they're not worth doing again, then I don't do them again. I also believe reflection not only should happen at the end of the session, but also throughout. In my case, I try to ask myself, am I designing or using activities that empower the students? Are the students becoming more independent? Do these activities help them use higher levels of critical thinking skills? Am I patient enough to allow them to discover things on their own? We work at a very fast pace, an intensive pace. So sometimes I feel tempted to help the students to try to get the points faster because we have a number of outcomes to reach in 7 weeks. Of course, this tactic backfires because students need time. They need time to process information or skills, to see their value, to make meaningful connections and an actual application beyond the classroom. We need to give students time, authorship, so they can evolve and grow. It's just a beautiful thing to be a part of. Constant reflection helps me not to forget these points.
Our administration has framed our annual review process as a conversation with faculty in order to encourage rigorous reflective practice. This conversation has been critical to my sustained growth as an ESL instructor. I consider myself very fortunate to work in a program that values reflective teaching. In my reflection, I found deeply familiarizing myself with the curricular context of a course provides a richer learning experience for my students. One specific example of this is with the higher level listening courses I teach in our program. The purpose of our program is to prepare international students to take university classes in English. The IEP, or Intensive English Program, where I work, has 7 levels. In light of the curricular context of my Level 5 listening class, I've developed learning activities that not only address the learning outcomes of the specific course I teach, but also the overall aims of the level. In addition to the students' continued linguistic development at levels 4, 5, and 6 of our intensive English program, there is a heavy emphasis on the development of critical thinking. Part of the transition from students learning English to learning in English is developing the ability to think critically about various perspectives, thoughts, opinions, and arguments. Based on my professional and personal reflection in various conversations with colleagues teaching other skills at this level, I've developed a series of materials for the Level 5 listening course to support students' practice of critical thinking across the level through active listening and note-taking. I provide students a series of listening tasks that are scaffolded based on Bloom's taxonomy. Students listen to various podcasts, TED Talks, and short lectures. Students then build from listening to understand and recall important details, to listening to analyze and evaluating a variety of arguments and perspectives on a current event or important issue. I use note-taking as a tool for critical thinking by having students create, analyze, and evaluate arguments. We also explore how the note-taking methods introduced in class can be adapted for other classes like writing, speaking, and reading.
Hi. First, let me make no claims about the following lesson. In any event, the lesson is on the 153 memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, and connecting events and commentary in the book to events in the real world, including the rise of Donald Trump. I started with what turned out to be a 15-minute warm-up that was no doubt too long. Students had listened to a talk 2 days before by Judy Kimmer on the effect of factory closings in Anderson, Indiana, on school children there. They were instructed to work with their electronic poster project partner and write on a small huddle board. They were asked to brainstorm about how Ms. Kimmer's talk related to Hillbilly Elegy and their electronic poster project. Then, one of the partners from each group was asked to explain how the talk had related to either the book or their electronic poster project. I took a minute to focus on the outcomes of the lesson and to show their connection to what we had just done. The outcomes are as follows. Analyze how an event or issue relates to the overall themes of the book, and analyze how events, themes in the book, relate to society and current events as a whole. The next activity was to watch about 3 minutes of an interview with the author of Hillbilly Elegy. Students were told in advance that everyone would answer the questions on a small huddle board. Number 1, why is J.D. Vance being interviewed? And number 2, how does what he says relate to today's reading? Students shared their answers. The most important thing they found was that the video clip established the link between the people in the book, politics, and Trump, that the book may explain why hillbillies or even working class people voted for Trump. After that, students were split into 4 groups to discuss and share their answers to some of the notebook questions they'd done for homework. Half the class discussed one set of questions, the other half another. Not all of the questions had been answered as homework, and one was answered by all groups. When I ended the discussion, I asked students to answer the following question, and then went into a more general discussion that related to that key question, number 10, that both groups answered. So the question was, Vance describes a man who quit his job because he did not like waking up early, but who seemed to think the root cause of his problems were due to President Obama's economic policies. How does Vance connect this kind of thinking to a cultural movement? To start the discussion, I asked the following questions. So this was bringing together what they had done in the homework discussion. So they had to bring it all together. What did you learn about working class people, hillbillies, and the cultural movement on the right in the United States? And they came up with the answer that these people blamed other people for their problems, including the cultural movement on the right. They blamed people such as Bush or Obama. What did you learn about these people in politics? So I just answered part of that. Is J.D. on the left or the right? What does he criticize about his people? Well, we never really got to that question. But what I wanted the students to see was that according to the author, many working class people, or hillbillies, the author sometimes conflates the two, blame others for problems for which they should take responsibility. I wanted to have students make the connection between the distrust of politicians as described in the chapter with the main character's grandmother, who thought all politicians are liars and crooks, and she was described earlier. The distrust of politicians leads to a distrust of big government and drain the swamp attitude towards Washington, D.C. And a drain the swamp attitude means getting rid of career politicians or getting rid of corruption, whatever you might see that to be. Meanwhile, Donald Trump was telling people he was not a politician, but a businessman, and that he could make America great again. That renewed greatness would please the hillbillies, whom the author claims sacralize the country almost as much as God, but who have lost their heroes. It didn't exactly work, as the students have little cultural knowledge. For example, all but one could not name the, quote, unwinnable wars, unquote, the U.S. has been involved in recently. The book assumes the reader has that knowledge. However, perhaps some exposure to the above ideas will give students the scaffolding to construct more. One of the problems was perhaps the students needed more wait time. That was discussed, but in fact, the questions were also rather difficult for the students to make the connections, so I'm not sure whether more wait time would have helped. If I were to do this lesson again, I think I would probably prep the students a little bit more, which my colleague Liz Alizates did, by explaining the difference between Republicans and Democrats. But I still feel that learning some of these issues helps them to understand the end of the book. And so I think this lesson is primary to understanding the conclusions and the end of the book. I gave the homework. The next reading was on love and networking, probably much to the students' relief to get away from politics. Thank you.
I'm Benjamin Bishop, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit about my experience with being a graduate assistant in the Intensive English Institute and a few of my recommendations for those who are just now joining our marvelous little program. First, I want to give you a bit of background. I was able to teach my own class at the IEI on my second session, meaning that I was given a class in the middle of the semester, only having observed and assisted in the first session, as well as having been allowed to teach a few class sessions. I found out that I had the class, which I did just a few days before we started, meaning that in spite of being prepared, there were still plenty of things for which I had not prepared. Hence the number of mistakes I made, and I'm now going to share with you. I'm also going to share with you a few of the limited things I did right, and give you an account of all that I can in order to make you aware of the general sorts of mistakes and hopefully learn from them. Now, the first thing that I did was to be culturally ignorant. One does not ask people of certain nationalities to speak on any perceived faults of their government. One does not give an assignment asking people to watch a video detailing how wonderful the opposing government that they hate may be. For example, one does not risk giving Costarricenses an assignment which entails speaking toward how the coffee grown in, say, Ecuador is superior. Not a great idea. These things can be recovered from. The first time that it happened, I was able to turn on my heels and just ask a different question. The second time, though, there was something of a different method which had to be undertaken. The entire day's assignment was based upon a video which the students had received as blatant propaganda for a government which they hated. As such, it was difficult to pivot. Even more, though, was planned to be taught based upon the reading, and as such, I had to replan the rest of the week. Thankfully, I was able to lean on an earlier video and work with my students in order to have a more copacetic discussion, rather than discussing how the other culture was, to quote, arrogant. Another mistake, or rather two, which I will compound into one in order to protect my ego, was based around the difficulty of assignments. In listening, the course which I taught, one will often choose to go out of one's way in order to ensure the video content is relevant and comprehensible to students, as well as, and this is important, interesting enough to keep the student engaged. The difficulty inherent is that of maintaining all of these points in equal share, relevant to where the student is in his or her learning. If there's any falter on any of these points, then womp womp, you lose your discussion to boredom. Or your difficult video means that your students just couldn't get what was thrown at them. My accident was twofold. First, I tended to put the more difficult assignments toward the start of the tenure. Second, I failed to vet one particularly difficult lecture. There are plenty of ways to tackle the second, and I will go into that in a moment. But let's first look at the difficulty of misbalance. By misbalancing my students' assignments, I ran out of relevant material by the end of the session, and I often had to make up things to talk about. Thankfully, listening has many objectives, and I was able to work those in. However, the students are, like any given human being, a bit of a challenge is necessary for growth. If you misbalance the assignments, as I did, there is an inherent difficulty with motivation. Simply, it gets too easy. Second, the difficult lecture. At one point, we had a unit on artificial intelligence and robotics, ultimately building into a postmodern conflict question. One of the unit readings, however, was for the Turing test. As many of you can tell based upon the terms I've just used, this was a complex unit. Even worse, it was one of the first few weeks of assignments. I selected a video full of figurative English, quick speech, and this was the kicker, British accents. Though that was very nearly a day lost to difficult videos, we turned the assignment around and, instead of staring at each other for an hour, we decided to simply watch the video and pick it apart. We lost a day of in-class work, but the students benefited from having the noticeably difficult video broken down for them. Now, finally, I get to talk about the things which I did correctly. First, scaffolding. If you get through your first week in TESOL without using the word scaffolding at least 4 times, what are you even doing with your life? I was able to scaffold certain items for the students, especially with note-taking. We could use methods of graphic organization, for example, in order to compare and contrast in-class videos. Then, the students would be asked to watch a video and come back into class the next day with, for example, a Venn diagram on the new video, after we had already worked on Venn diagrams in class. I was able to take notes on what worked and what didn't in order to plan for my next instructional period, whether it be in listening or another area. Many instructors, including me, make notes on their lesson plans in order to determine what did or what did not work. This allows for future planning to operate far more smoothly and with a great deal more planning. So what to do for next time? I'm going to revisit my pedagogy by being more careful and more intentional regarding the cultures represented in my class and trying to avoid problem areas. I'm going to focus more properly on scaffolding for my students. And I'm going to make sure that I work on ensuring that assignments are balanced in accordance with that which my students are capable of doing. And these are my recommendations as you move forward. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Christine Ellsworth, and today I'd like to share with you a short task you can do with students as pairs and my reflections on why I think it's beneficial. So to begin, this is something I do frequently. I pause whatever I'm doing and I ask students to have a quick chat with their neighbor or with their partner. So for example, if I'm teaching about paraphrasing, I'll stop and say, chat with your neighbor for a minute. What makes a good paraphrase? Chat with your neighbor. And so then I give them really just a quick minute or less to have a short conversation. When they're finished, I call on several different people and I ask them to tell me what they talked about. So this is a really easy task that you can have students do with pairs, and I like to do it when I'm trying to communicate big ideas. So I have a few reflections on why I think this is beneficial. First of all, I love that this gets the students' voices in the classroom and not just my own. Oftentimes, students will bring up ideas that I didn't think about. So I love that this gets at things that they think are important in addition to the things that I'm thinking about. Another reason I think it's beneficial is more students get a chance to talk. For that minute, everyone is talking all at once. And I like the fact that it gives shyer students a chance to hash out their idea one-on-one before I have to ask them to speak in front of the whole class. So I feel like it gives them some more confidence. And the last thing that I think is really beneficial is the fact that it breaks up the flow of the classroom. So, you know, anytime you do one thing for too long, it can get boring. So I like that, you know, I talk, then they talk, then we share ideas, and it kind of breaks things up. I also like that it keeps them accountable. They know that I'm going to call on them and ask them what they talked about, so they're ready with a response. After doing this quite a lot, I've thought about it and I've realized some things you need to look out for. One thing is make sure they stay on task. The biggest thing to watch for is that you don't give them too much time. They really just need a minute or less to have a focused conversation, and if you give them too much time, they get off track. The other thing to look out for is that even if you get a couple right answers, don't assume that means everyone's on the same page. Make sure you call on many different people to find out what others are thinking. So there you have it. That's a quick, easy activity you can have students do in pairs, and why I think it's beneficial.
In this brief reflective teaching video, I will talk about what reflective teaching means to me, why I do it, and how I do it. So first of all, what is reflective teaching to me and why do I do it? It means constantly being aware of the logic of my lesson planning, the flow and connectedness of the teaching material, as well as how it all plays out in the classroom. It also means wanting to continuously develop as an educator. What I mean by that is that by analyzing and reflecting on my teaching methods, I am always professionally developing and working on bettering myself as an ESL instructor in order to provide the best learning experience for the students. So why do I do it? The ultimate goal of each lesson plan is to make the students understand and learn the lesson. In order to see how well I reach this goal, I have to evaluate and measure the effectiveness of the materials, activities, and the pace of the lesson plan. For example, if I plan to work on developing a strong body paragraph in a writing class and I wanted to try out an activity, I would go back and think about how clear my instructions were, if the students were as engaged as I expected them to be, and if the product of the activity was what I asked for it to be. If not, then why not? Were there any unexpected obstacles? Similarly, I would think about any potential changes I would make to this activity if I decided to use it in the future. Also, every classroom is different, and what worked for one class might not work in another. A teacher has to be aware of all the different variables involved in teaching in order to know how to best address different needs. So finally, how do I do it in my class? I typically use Google or Word documents for all my lesson plans. Throughout the 7-week session, I keep an ongoing document where I plan a lesson, and then after the lesson, while planning my next one, I briefly go back and mentally and in writing reflect on the completed class. If things went well, I put a check mark or a smiley or a thumbs up. Sometimes I even add things that I learned from students, suggestions that they gave me, or things that I thought of after the activity had already been completed. If, however, there were things that did not go well or that could use some time or classroom management adjustment, clear instructions, or a completely different activity, I revise the plan and leave myself a comment for the next time I teach that specific course. So some of my final thoughts on reflective teaching is that a teacher who is striving to be a good teacher has to teach reflectively. They have to be open to continuous professional development that involves self-observation and self-evaluation. I believe it is only this way that they will continue to learn about best practices.